Hey everyone, in this video, I'm going to prove to you that color grading can be easy, and all it takes is unlearning some of the bad habits that you've likely picked up along the way that have probably overcomplicated the process for you. So everything I'm going to demo today is here in DaVinci Resolve, but all of these tactics are extremely fundamental and foundational and can be applied in any software, whether you're in Final Cut Pro, Premiere Pro, any other software for that matter. We're talking about the basics and the philosophy behind color grading. So toward the end of this video, I'm going to walk you through a very specific workflow that you can apply to every single shot that you ever grade. And that's really going to become the cornerstone of your workflow as a colorist. But before we get there, I want to briefly unpack 5 of the most common color grading myths that you've likely picked up yourself if you're watching this video, and how you can unlearn some of these bad habits to achieve better results in less time. And the first myth we've already kind of gone over, which is that color grading has to be hard. No, it doesn't. In fact, color grading can be incredibly easy if you approach it the right way and if your source footage is strong enough. The fact of the matter is, the biggest variable in terms of your overall color palette is your source footage. It's not the software you're using, it's not your creative skill, it's not the tool set, it's none of that. It's the quality of the source footage. So I'm going to show you this as a sample here just to prove that point. So this footage here that we're looking at, you're going to see in some of our other Cinecolor videos. This is from one of our controlled test shoots. This was captured on the Arri Alexa 35 in log C4, and this is arguably the best cinema camera, at least digital cinema camera, ever made as far as color science is concerned, and it's a great baseline for us to work from. So this is just the native footage. It just has a basic CST, or color space transform, so it's not being viewed here in log. We're seeing the full spectrum of colors, but we have not done any additional correction, any white balancing, anything like that. So now compare that to some of the lowest quality footage from our test shoot, which was shot on GoPro. And I'm going to apply a LUT here just so you can see what the GoPro footage looks like with that same type of color space transformation applied. I'm going to toggle this on and off so you can see there's a vast difference in the quality of the image right off the bat between these two cameras. These two shots were captured under identical lighting conditions in the exact same studio, but on two very different cameras with very different sensors and lenses and codecs. And the result is two very different images. So right off the bat, you can imagine if you were to try to grade this shot, it would be a lot faster and easier to get this to look good than this one. And the reason being because we would need fewer steps to achieve what we would like with this shot. So let's say, for example, we would want this shot to maybe look a little bit brighter, a little punchier, and have kind of a warmer hue overall. With just a couple of corrections, we can pull up our gain setting. So this is just our highlight setting. We can pull down our shadows. We can pull up the mids. I'm just going to add some global contrast overall as well. And I'm going to now warm this up just a little bit, and I'm going to cool down the shadows. And just like that, in just a few steps, let's go take a look at this. We've gone from a base grade to what might be more of a final look. It did not take a whole lot of effort to get there. Now compare that to the GoPro footage. This shot is going to need a lot more work. There's some obvious white balance issues. It's skewing very cool and sort of magenta, so we're going to have to push some green into the image. We're going to have to try to warm it up, and then we're going to have to adjust that not only globally, but on the lift gamma gain settings as well. So we're getting hopefully the most neutral image possible as a starting point. I'm going to warm that up slightly more. We can add some contrast to it. We can add a little bit of saturation. And you can see as I'm pushing and pulling this around with about the same amount of time and corrections that I applied to the Alexa footage, it doesn't look anywhere near as good. This is going to take a lot of work to get even close to the Alexa footage. And this is one of the things that filmmakers get so frustrated with when they're trying to grade lower quality footage from mirrorless cameras or even good cinema cameras that just weren't exposed properly. The fact is, when you're working as a filmmaker or colorist and you're just getting started, started and you're frustrated that you can't get your grades to look anything like your favorite movie or TV show or whatever it may be, the reality is that the source footage is almost always the biggest culprit. Many of your favorite feature films or TV shows were not heavily stylized or heavily cleaned up in post because they're working with footage that was captured on extremely high quality sensors to extremely high quality codecs, or in some cases as RAW files. And on the day, the best possible lighting was used that's not creating awkward color spikes or skin tone issues or other problems that need to be solved later. So just understand that the source footage that you're working with can often be the biggest culprit in you not achieving the look that you're after, whether it's an obvious white balance issue, an overexposed shot, a low quality recording codec, poor lighting conditions, whatever the case may be. If the source footage is not strong, then your final result will always suffer. That brings us to myth number 2. You need to be using DaVinci Resolve to achieve the best possible colors in post. That's just not the case. In reality, you can achieve beautiful colors using any software. It's about what you're doing to the colors, not which tool you're using to make those adjustments. There's a reason why so many filmmakers, myself included, gravitate to DaVinci Resolve because it is the best overall color software and it does have the most granular control over your image, and it just streamlines your workflow in some really impressive ways. But if you're not quite there yet and you're just using Final Cut or Premiere to grade your shots, you can do so much of the same work just using the built-in tools. So right here in Final Cut, I'm going to show you a very similar grade on the same test shot to what we did just a moment ago in DaVinci Resolve. I'm just going to hit Command 6. It's going to bring up my basic color correction tool here. I'm not even using the color wheels. I'm just using the color board just to show you that, again, you don't need the fanciest tools to achieve the best results. So in this case, I'm just going to adjust the exposure a little bit, drop that down. I'm going to increase the saturation levels, and I'm going to warm up the midtones and highlights here and cool off the shadows slightly. So this is a very similar look to what we achieved in DaVinci Resolve in basically the same amount of time and the same amount of steps. And obviously this was possible because the source footage was great and it did not need a lot of work, which goes back to our previous point. But hopefully this illustrates the fact that you can achieve great colors in your software. Once you get into color matching shot by shot, you might want to use Resolve to make that process easier, bring up reference frames, save grades more easily that you can apply throughout, and just color manage your project in a more efficient and professional way. But if you're dealing with a 30-second commercial or even a short film and you want to contain your entire color process into your editing software, it's entirely possible to do that. And I've even done that myself. Even though I've been using DaVinci Resolve for over a decade, I'm very comfortable using it. There are just times when it does make sense to contain my color workflow inside of Final Cut, usually if I'm turning something around very quickly, and I never feel like I'm sacrificing quality, even if some of the tools are more limited. Myth number 3, you need power windows, tracking, and endless secondaries to make your image look good. The truth is that power windows, tracking, and other more complex secondary tools can be extremely helpful if you need them, but oftentimes you don't need them, and using them can actually over-stylize your image in a way that feels unnatural and that might not hold up as well as your film or project ages over the years. So let's jump back here to our test footage on the Alexa 35 just to showcase some of the additional tools that filmmakers are often pressured to use when they're color grading. And there's nothing, again, wrong with these tools. I use them all the time and they can be very helpful, but they should not be the foundation for your grade, especially before you've mastered the basics. So in this case, you might want to add, let's say, a power window to kind of dial down the background exposure a little bit and help bring the focal point more to the subject. So I'm just going to soften up this window. I'm going to add an outside node. I'm just going to turn down just the exposure a little bit in the highlights. And that does help to focus us a little bit more inside. And I can actually go back to this second node and bump this up and, really kind of push and pull. But notice as I'm doing this that I have to have a very trained eye as a colorist colorist to understand the implications of some of these different settings that I'm tweaking. So for example, as I dial up the exposure and the highlights, I'm also simultaneously losing some saturation in the skin tones. So I'm going to go back here. Look how much more saturated her skin tones look here before and after. This can obviously be fixed, but typically it's going to either involve an overall saturation adjustment or what commonly filmmakers and colorists end up doing, which is a color key. So they're going to go here to the qualifier and select the skin tones and just isolate those skin tones. They're going to adjust the softness settings and dial in all of these different parameters and then saturate just those skin tone areas. But I'm going to take it too far so you could see eventually the image is going to break apart. You could see that her lips are not being affected by the saturation adjustment, and some of these boards and things in the background are. So all of this can continue to be refined with additional power windows or additional settings that we're dialing in here in terms of our qualifier HSL levels. We can also use the gain just to push some warmth into the highlights and the mids like this. And there's, again, nothing wrong with working like this. You can absolutely make these micro adjustments. But my whole philosophy of keeping things simple is to not make these adjustments unless you absolutely need to, unless you are a more trained colorist, because every adjustment that you make is going to have some counter effect to it. So if you're really saturating and warming up the skin tones, that's going to make some of the other areas feel less saturated. You may also just push your colors too far and kind of lose sight of where you're at. So you have to be very careful when you're working on these granular levels. And then of course, if you have things like power windows, and let's say this subject was moving around the frame, we would then need to go into our tracker setting, and we would have to actually motion track this to ensure that the power window is following her movement. Again, none of this is bad. It's amazing that we have these tools. And like I said, I personally use these tools all the time when I need them, but I try to go as far as possible without using these tools in order to keep my workflow very simple. And the other reason I like to work like that is because I'm kind of a purist at heart when it comes to analog film technology. I've shot a lot on 16mm and 35mm, even 8mm film. I have a fairly good understanding of what goes into the photochemical process, the scanning, the color correction in the digital intermediate stage. And one of the things that I love about working with the analog format is how simple it is. You often get the footage back from the lab and it just works perfectly as is. You can, of course, go in digitally and really refine things as we're doing here. And as you might see on major Hollywood feature films that are shot on 35mm, or even smaller budget productions that just want to go the extra mile. But so much is just baked in through that photochemical process that it really goes to show just how much can be done with some basic overarching adjustments as opposed to these micro granular level tweaks. So let's just take a screenshot of this. Again, this is not a final grade by any means. I'm just trying to simulate here what maybe an amateur colorist or someone who's just starting out may do to their image without realizing that they're sort of degrading it in certain ways. Now I'm going to remove some of these different nodes. We'll go back to our base grade. And now I'm just going to try to emulate more of that film photochemical process just using the most basic tools I have available. So I'm going to take the curves adjustment and I'm going to make an overall adjustment to the exposure curve to dial in the shadows a little bit more. I'm going to go over here to our luminance versus saturation curve. I'm going to pull up the mid-tone saturation. So we're bringing in some saturation to the skin, but we're not introducing any additional saturation into the shadows or the highlight areas. In fact, I might even pull some saturation out of the shadows here. And then we're going to make some overall color balance adjustments before we went warm overall. So now I'll start by going cool, and then I'll warm up the skin tones a little bit. I'm going to add some more contrast overall to this shot. Going to neutralize the skin tones because they were looking a little bit magenta. And I'm going to go back to our contrast curve. I'm actually going to adjust this a little bit more to bring up the shadow levels instead. So this is going to give us kind of a more filmic, more vintagey analog look. And if you take a look at this, again, with just a few adjustments, overall, this is a really great looking image. I'm not trying to compare apples and oranges here, but if we compare that to this grade this feels a lot more synthetic because we've used some of these secondary tools in a way that was not very precise. We've oversaturated the skin tones. We've added this kind of awkward power window vignette thing, which kind of works, but kind of feels unnatural as well. When we go back to this shot, to me personally, this looks a lot more cinematic, a lot more filmic and natural than the other version. So again, I want to reiterate, I am by no means criticizing the use of secondary tools. We all have them in our toolkit for a reason, and they're incredibly powerful when you know how to dial them in properly. But you don't want to jump ahead and start making these granular adjustments before you've really mastered your base correction with the simplest tools that you have at your disposal, whether it's just some custom curves, whether it's your primary color wheels, or any of the other basic tools that you're going to have in every color and editing software. That's really all you should need to create a really strong base grade. And then if you really want to use some of those secondary tools to pull a color key, add a mask, use some tracking, and really get granular on that micro level, by all means go for it. And that can push your image over the edge another 10% in terms of quality, but it could also hurt your image if you try to apply those changes too early in the process, and especially before you've maximized your capability with just the simple primaries tools that are available to you. Myth number 4, LUTs are unprofessional and not used by pros. In reality, LUTs have been used for decades and started out specifically for professional workflows. For example, if a colorist is working on a show that had shot for 6 months using a very specific show LUT, so often they're going to use that show LUT as part of their base grade because that's going to allow them to see exactly what the director and the cinematographer had in mind on set, and it's going to get them so much closer to the right starting point. And from there, they can build additional corrections, which may be completely manual, but they also may choose to then use a finishing LUT or a film emulation LUT at the end of their process before they do their final output. So if you choose to use LUTs in your workflow, then by all means use them, and there's a time and a place to use them where they can actually save you a ton of time, especially on a shot like this. So we're going to be looking at this test footage. This was captured on Sony S-Log 3, and I'm going to show you just the difference of a bad LUT versus a good LUT. And the LUT I'm going to demo first is the native Sony S-Log 3 to Rec. 709 conversion. This LUT just does not really look great. I've showed this LUT in other videos, and it's the reason why so many filmmakers often give Sony a hard time for their overall color science and the colors that they're getting from their cameras, is because the native LUT that comes bundled with a lot of editing software isn't really great. So this looks kind of lifeless and drab, but if we compare that to one of our Cinecolor LUTs here, I'm going to apply this. You can see that that's a totally different image. Look at the before and after, and just note how much more detail we're seeing in her highlight areas in her hair, the skin tones that feel more natural, the shadow levels, the color balance overall. Just the entire image as a whole feels like this is a much stronger base grade as opposed to that native Sony LUT. It's worth noting that if you're in DaVinci Resolve specifically, you can also apply a color space transform instead of a LUT, and that will get you to a better starting place than the native Sony LUT, but still not probably an optimal starting place for your overall color profile. So I'll just demo that for you quickly. We're going to drag this color space transform onto this node. We're going to change the input color space to Sony S-Gamut 3. We're going to change the input gamma to S-Log 3. And that's going to look much better than the standard Rec. 709 LUT here. Definitely a better starting point, but still feels pretty synthetic. It has some oversaturated colors, has sort of that Sony video look. And when you compare that to the Cinecolor LUT here, this feels a lot more dialed in. That's because this was modeled after Alexa 35. So whether you use our LUTs, you use some other LUT, or you create your own entirely, whatever your process may be, just know that LUTs can be an essential part of your workflow, and you shouldn't write them off just because there are some bad LUTs floating around out there. Now for myth number 5, every shot requires a completely different approach. when in reality, every shot should actually follow the exact same workflow and order of operations. What you do within that workflow is of course going to change based on what the shot needs, but you're not starting from scratch every time. And this is what I was talking about at the beginning of the video in terms of having a workflow that you can follow on every single shot. So it really comes down to the order of operations. So now let's take a look at this S-Log3 footage and take a look at how we can improve the quality and create a really great base grade in just a few steps. And in this case, I am actually going to use multiple nodes, even though we could do a lot of these corrections just on a single node. I just want to make it very clear to you as you're watching when I'm moving on from one correction to the next. So we'll start here with our first node, and the first thing we're always going to have to do is bring this into the correct color space, and we can use a color space transform or a LUT. In this case, I'm going to use a LUT just to show you a more difficult starting point. This is the LUT that a lot of you guys are going to be using. So the first thing you're going to do is add that LUT or color space transformation to bring it into the correct color space to be working in. The next step is always to adjust the overall exposure and contrast levels. So right here, our contrast is kind of all off. So I'm going to do this on a separate node, again, just to make it very clear. And I'm going to be looking specifically at the highlights here and at the midtones. And I want to make sure that I bring these highlights down so they're not clipping, but I also bring the midtones up a little bit so we're feeling some more life brought back into the skin tone. So let's start by bringing this down. I'm going to push and pull these quite a bit just to do this very quickly. And we're not looking for a perfect grade just yet, but I just want to show you exactly how far you can and sometimes should pull your image apart to get your contrast levels sitting where they need to be. All right, so you can see just with that initial correction, which is by no means final or perfect, we've improved a lot. I'm going to turn this off and then on. Take a look at how much more natural her skin tones are feeling. There's less blown out highlights in her hair and in the light at the top of the frame. You could actually see the detail coming back here in the color chart. And overall, our levels are much closer to where we want them to be, although not completely final just yet. So for our next step here, we're going to be working on the white balance and fixing any overall color balance and tint issues with the shot. One thing that I recommend, especially if you're newer to color and you don't quite have the eye for it yet, turn your saturation up a little bit at this stage. You could always turn it down, but let's turn it up to about 10 points on here to 60 on DaVinci Resolve. And that's just going to help us see the issues with the shot a little bit more clearly. Thankfully, in this case, there's no overall major color balance issues, but we can adjust it slightly. I feel like overall it's feeling a little bit warm for me, so I'm going to take the temperature setting, dial that down slightly. I'm going to adjust the tint as well to get rid of some of the magenta in the skin tones. And then I'm going to create more color separation by individually affecting the lift, gamma, and gain. And this is essentially just creating color contrast by pushing a little bit more cool tone into the shadows and a little bit more of a warmer tone into the midtones and highlights. And you can see just by doing that, we're getting a much more pleasing initial image. So let me toggle that on and off. So that's before and after with that color balance adjustment. Again, this is not final, but you could see pretty quickly that we're improving the color quality overall here. And color separation in general is really important to your final image. If your colors feel like they're too washed out or if they're bleeding into each other too much, you're just going to feel like you have a very kind of uniform palette that doesn't quite grab the viewer in the same way as if you increase the color contrast by pulling some of the colors in different areas. So again, lift, gamma, and gain, you can almost imitate a blockbuster look where you're pushing a little bit of teal into the shadows and a little bit of warmth into the highlights and maybe the mids depending on the shot. You're not trying to over stylize it as if it were a blockbuster shot, but maybe taking it 20% of the way there is going to really help you get those colors dialed in and looking a lot more natural at this stage. So I'm going to make a couple final adjustments here just globally to my temperature and tint. And now this is looking really great. If we take a quick full screen before and after, this is where we were just with the contrast adjustment. And here is improving color balance. It's a little bit oversaturated, so we can now take our saturation and dial that back down. But we do need some, so I'm going to take it down to about 56 here, or maybe even 57. And now that's looking pretty solid for this stage. It's feeling neutral, balanced, good amount of contrast, fairly natural skin tones, and we can move on to the next stage. At this point in the process, if you are going to apply more granular secondary corrections, such as a skin tone adjustment, you can do that here. Again, you don't always have to do this, and I would refrain from doing too many of these if you're newer to color, but let me show you a quick example of how you can use the color warper tool specifically for hue and saturation just to adjust the skin tone. So I'm just going to grab a sample of her skin tone right here, and we're going to take this and we're just going to dial it up just a little bit. And just that one adjustment has added a little bit more vibrancy and life to her skin tone without affecting the rest of the image. So you don't want to push these secondaries too far, as we looked at before. You want to make sure you're using the right tool for the job as well. In this case, I think it's actually now a little bit too saturated, so I'm going to dial that down a little bit, but just that little adjustment did help us out. The next stage is really the stage that most people think of when they're color grading, and where most people go wrong, because most people start with this, which is the creative look, as opposed to starting with everything else we did, which is giving ourselves a really nice base grade with maybe some very simple secondary adjustments if you choose to do so to really dial it in. Only once that's done should you apply your creative look. And the reason for that is because you're going to get much better results much more quickly if you follow this correct order of operations. And it's also especially helpful if you have multiple shots in the same sequence that you're going to apply the same creative look to. So let's say in this case, we warm this shot up and create sort of a golden hour aesthetic. We should be able to copy and paste that exact same color palette to any other shots that are accurately matched to this one. But you're not going to be able to do that unless all of the shots are starting from a neutral and similar base grade starting point. So now let's make some very quick adjustments to give this a warmer kind of end of day, almost golden hour look. And we'll start with the temperature adjustment. We'll just turn that all the way up to 700. Going to pull the tint up to about 10 here, and the combination of that is giving us a much warmer, more inviting look. I'll make some very micro adjustments to our levels just to kind of bring up the highlights a little bit, bring up the midtones a little bit, and then I'm going to add some more contrast back into the image. Even though there's already a healthy amount, that's just the style that I'm going for in this particular shot. I think this is looking really great. If we want to take things further, we can adjust the lift, gamma, and gain just slightly to create more color contrast while still maintaining that kind of warm, sunlit type of look. Maybe bump the saturation back up a couple of points. And you can see just with those very quick few adjustments, we've created sort of this brighter, more warm, inviting look. Let's say this is more or less where we want to be in terms of color temperature and tone overall. The next step, if we choose to, is to apply film emulation. This is an optional step. You can either use one of our film emulation LUTs, which is going to give you very color accurate quality that's going to match standard 35mm, 65mm motion picture film stocks, or you can do it manually. In this case, I'm not going to do a full film emulation, but what I will do is just create more of a filmic curve on these shadows, because we've lost a lot of detail in the shadows. We don't necessarily need to bring it all back, but we do want to bring up the overall levels in the shadow area so it starts to feel a little less crushed and a little softer. And I'll do the same thing on the highlights. I'm just going to roll these off. So this is a very basic sort of film curve. You can see a before and after, just kind of bringing down the highlights, bringing up the shadows. And now this is looking a lot better and closer to a final grade. So the very last thing that I like to do in the order of operations are just some final global adjustments to help blend things together and mitigate any secondary effects that came along while we made some of the main adjustments. For example, if we're adjusting contrast, that's sometimes going to either introduce or pull away saturation depending on which direction we're going with it. So in this case, looking at the shot, I'm going to pull back a little bit of the saturation, just about 2 points, and I'm going to cool it down because I think we warmed it up a little bit more than I would probably do on a real grade, although I am going to push some warmth into just the highlights. And we'll take a look at that. And now that's looking a little bit better as a final look. And let's compare that to that original S-Log3 footage, which now in comparison looks way more synthetic, has that video aesthetic to it. Highlights are blown out, the skin tones are unnatural. And we got there very quickly and easily in just a few steps. So if there's one piece of advice I want to leave you with, it's this. If you can achieve your desired effect in less steps with less tools and a more minimalistic outlook on your process, you're going to work so much faster and you're going to get better results because you're not going to be creating endless secondary corrections, micromanaging your colors, and creating more work for yourself that you don't necessarily need to do, especially if you're at an early stage as a filmmaker or as a colorist. The best thing you could do is keep it simple and be very purposeful with your changes. Assuming you're working with decent footage that was shot well under normal lighting conditions, you shouldn't need more than a basic color space conversion, a white balance adjustment, and some minor creative stylization to get your image looking really, really strong. Anything above and beyond that is great if and when you want to go there, but don't start with the more complicated tools when you can get 80 or 90% of the way there with just a few very simple steps. Hopefully this was helpful for those of you looking to get better results in fewer steps, whether you're in Resolve, Final Cut, Premiere, or any software for that matter. And if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe on YouTube to help us bring you more videos just like this one.